So Bernie Sanders was asked a smear question during his town hall on CNN a few days ago. The reason I call this a smear question is because it's set up so that there's no way Bernie wins. There's no way he gives a good enough answer to this question because the trick is in the framing of the question. So this is like next level political chess clever here. And I'd be floored if this student really came up with the question. I think this is just like with the previous CNN town halls. There's some third way, new democratic corporate organization that's coming up with an anti-Bernie strategy. And this is the best yet that I've seen from them. I think this is incredibly clever. And you're about to see his answer. He's going to be asked about his position on convicted criminals voting. Let's watch, and then we'll break it down.
Senator Sanders, you have said that you believe that people with felony records should be allowed to vote while in prison. Does this mean that you would support enfranchising people like the Boston Marathon bomber, a convicted terrorist and murderer? Do you think that those convicted of sexual assault should have the opportunity to vote for politicians who could have a direct impact on women's rights?
Okay, thank you for the question, Ann. And let me just say this. What our campaign is about, and what I believe, is creating a vibrant democracy. Today, as you may know, we have one of the lowest voter turnouts of any major country on earth. I want to see us have one of the highest voter turnouts. And by the way, what we're seeing is more young people getting involved in the political process, but not enough. And in my view, if young people voted at the same percentage that older people voted in this country, we would transform this nation. But to get to your point, we live in a moment where cowardly Republican governors are trying to suppress the vote. And in fact, right here, as you may know, in New Hampshire, the legislature and the governor are working hard to make it more difficult for young people to vote. And to me, that is an incredibly undemocratic, un-American process. And I say to those people, by the way, if you don't have the guts to participate in free and fair elections, you should get another job and get out of politics. All right? So we got to... So here is, and to answer your question, as it happens in my own state of Vermont, from the very first days of our state's history, what our Constitution says is that everybody can vote. That is true. So people in jail can vote. Now, here is my view. If somebody commits a serious crime, sexual assault, murder, they're going to be punished. They may be in jail for 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, their whole lives. That's what happens when you commit a serious crime. But I think the right to vote is inherent to our democracy. Yes, even for terrible people. Because once you start chipping away and you say, well, that guy committed a terrible crime, not going to let him vote, or that person did that, not going to let that person vote, you're running down a slippery slope. So I believe that people who commit crimes, they pay the price. When they get out of jail, I believe they certainly should have the right to vote. But I do believe that even if they are in jail, they're paying their price to society, but that should not take away their inherent American right to participate in our democracy.
Applause for the answer. My follow-up question goes to this being like you're writing an opposition ad against you by saying you think the Boston Marathon bomber should vote not after he pays his debt to society, but while he's in jail. You sure about that?
Well, Chris, I think I have written many 30-second opposition ads throughout my life. This will be just another one. But I do believe, look, this is what I believe. Do you believe in democracy? Do you believe that every single American 18 years of age or older who's an American citizen has the right to vote? Once you start chipping away at that, believe me, that's what our Republican governors all over this country are doing. They come up with all kinds of excuses why people of color, young people, poor people can't vote. And I will do everything I can to resist it. This is a democracy. We've got to expand that democracy. And I believe every single person does have the right to vote.
Okay, so what I'm going to ask you to do here is put aside your own perspective and your own bias. We're all biased. We're all Bernie people. We love Bernie. But try for a second to understand that it's certainly possible for you to like something that he's saying, but also that this is not necessarily what's going to play with the overwhelming majority of Americans. And in fact, that's a fact. So you might like it, but the media got the exact headlines that they wanted out of this. It was in every mainstream outlet. Bernie Sanders supports the Boston Marathon bomber voting. And let me give you some numbers on this. So according to a Huffington Post YouGov poll from pretty recently, 63% of Americans say that individuals who've committed felonies should have their right to vote, but only after they've served their sentence. So while they're in prison, they don't have that, and then when they get out of prison, they get it restored. That's 63% of Americans. Now, what number supports Bernie's exact position here? 24% of Americans think that those in prison for a felony should be able to vote while in prison. So that means that, again, putting aside our own bias here, because we all love Bernie with all of our heart, that means 76% of the American people disagree with his position. And then furthermore, and this is why this trick was so fucking genius, the way that it was framed was, Bernie, are you going to take the side of rapists, and are you going to take the side of the Boston Marathon bomber and say that they specifically have the right to vote? And nobody loves Bernie more than me, but he walked right into that trap. So let me explain a couple things here. Let me break this down for you. Hopefully all of you are not triggered by my commentary thus far. Here's the harsh truth. The establishment wants to take down Bernie, and they want to take him down more than anything. But how do you do that? Every single time they've gone after him, his numbers have gone up. So if every attack you have against him is totally ineffectual, and if anything makes him stronger, well then how do you take him down? They came up with a brilliant answer. And the answer is, get Bernie to talk about and pontificate on the very few issues, the very rare issues, where he's actually totally out of the mainstream with the American public. So you understand that? When Bernie talks about Medicare for all endlessly, 70% of the American people agree with Medicare for all. The more he talks, the more his poll numbers go up, the more people love him. When he talks about raising taxes on the rich, 58% of the American people want to raise taxes on the rich. When he talks about legalizing marijuana, 62% of the American people want to legalize marijuana. And the list goes on and on and on. 80% want to raise the minimum wage. Bernie's always out there talking about a living wage. The list goes on and on and on. On over 90% of the issues, he's with the overwhelming majority of the American public. So, if we can't attack him, let's have him effectively attack himself. How? Just get him to focus only on the issues where the American people disagree with him. So why do you think the reparations question keeps coming up? Here's the answer. He can't win on that. Why can't he win on that? If he says, I'm against reparations, you're losing a strong contingent of the Democratic base and a strong number of black voters. So he can't say, I'm against reparations, because that's some of his base will get pissed off. He can't say he's for reparations, because then the overwhelming majority of the American people will disagree with him. So it's a lose-lose. So the trick is in the question. The question itself is the gotcha. So then how do you deal with a situation like this? Now, a lot of you will say, and I partially agree with this for sure, well, listen, that Bernie doesn't do political calculations. He's just honest, which is why we love him. I agree. That's totally true. 100%. But also, guys, we're not playing checkers anymore, son. We're playing chess. We got to graduate. The strategy's got to be there. And it's my political assessment that you do not just casually say, I disagree with 75% of the American people on this issue. And it's just a quick answer. No, that's not going to fly. So how should Bernie have handled it? Because I could criticize all day, but that doesn't mean dick if I don't have a strategy that I think would be preferable and that I think would be better. So there's a couple different ways he could have answered this. One of the ways is you have to pull a Trump. So what does Trump do? You can't do exactly this because it wouldn't make sense in this context, but Trump, whenever he's faced with something from the media he doesn't like, He just swats it aside. He's like, fake news. And then he swats it aside and then he moves on and to talk about whatever he wants to talk about. So how could Bernie have done it? Well, for starters, you could call a spade and just be like, excuse me, I think that's a ridiculous question. And I think you're trivializing a very important issue of voting rights. I think that's a ridiculous question. I think that's a gotcha question. I think that's a smear question. And I'm obviously concerned about all the non-violent offenders who've been disenfranchised by our ridiculous system. Boom, that's it. Move on. Get past it. Okay? That's what I think would have been the best response. Basically, call it out for what it is. Excuse me, I think that's a ridiculous question, and I think it's obvious that what I'm concerned about and people like me are concerned about is the disenfranchisement of all the non-violent offenders who are in prison. That's such a better answer than what he gave there, because you're denying them their headline. And then the other thing he could have done is, you have to give people some of what they urgently want. So let me explain. Back in the day, Michael Dukakis, who ran for president, was the Democratic nominee. He was obliterated in a debate because he walked into the most obvious trap in the world. There was a question that was asked of him. Now, he's against the death penalty, something I agree with him on. But one of the moderators said, how would you respond, and would you want the death penalty for a guy who would rape and murder your wife, Kitty Dukakis? And what was Michael Dukakis' response? Well, no, as you know, I'm against the death penalty, and I think that the numbers show that it is not a deterrent. And the answer was so robotic and machine-like and unsympathetic and not human that everybody was like, fuck you, bitch. That's going to be your answer? Really? Your wife's raped and killed, and you're like, I would form a committee to look into it. It was just, no, shut the fuck up. You're a human being, right? So you got to give a little bit of the... So here's a way that he could have answered that question. He should have said, would I want that guy to die? Of course I'd want that guy to die. I'm a human being. If he did that to my wife, what would my reaction be? My reaction would be exactly what you would expect it to be. And what a horrendous question that is. I don't want to think about that for even a split second. But here's the reality. When we have the death penalty, 4% of the time, at least, we get the wrong people. So that means the state is murdering innocent people. And of course, we cannot have that be the system. That's a broken system. And that's the way you should have responded. But he didn't do that. He went right to... He's such an ideologue that he went right to the answer without soaking in the ramifications of the question. Now, for Bernie, could have kind of done the same thing where he said, the Boston Marathon bomber. Well, first and foremost, let me say, nobody has any sympathy for somebody who does such a monstrous act and such a terrible thing and affects so many women and children and men in such a negative fashion and destroyed so many lives. None of us have any sympathy for a man like that. The reality of the situation is we have disenfranchised non-violent offenders, and we need to stop that. There you go. That's another way you could have answered it. I don't think he gave a good answer. And I know you guys love Bernie, and listen, I do too, and I saw basically all the commentary from all the other left-wing hosts have basically just been, Bernie's right, let's play defense. Your analysis has got to go deeper than that. We're not playing checkers anymore, we're playing chess. He's the front runner for the Democratic nomination. You have to have a clever strategy to deal with tripwire questions like this, and if you don't, you're being silly. And it's not enough to just say, bro, voting's a right, so like this isn't a hard question. It's not a hard question. When 75% of the American people disagree with you, it's not a hard question. If you're that dismissive of 75% of the American people, you're politically incredibly ignorant. I mean, that's just embarrassing almost. So that's one way he could have handled it. Another thing that he should do now that the cat's already out of the bag is you should interview people who are felons who are already voting. So go to Vermont, go to Maine, 2 states that have it. Go interview these people, show how look, there's a nonviolent drug offender, perfectly lovely person. Now you know his story. Now you have a personal connection to him, and you see he obviously should be able to vote. Also, go to states where they can't vote and go interview somebody who obviously should be able to vote, but he can't vote because he's in prison for a nonviolent offense. Reframe the issue on your terms. You have to reframe the issue on your terms. And the final point that I'll make on this, I mean, I could really go on and on and on and on about this, but it's not enough to just be like, it's a right, and a right is a right, and a right is absolute, and that's the end of the conversation, because by that logic, if a right is absolute, then why can't we get rid of the age limits? We should get rid of the age limits, right? If a right is a right, and it's absolute, then a 16-year-old is going to turn around and say to you, well, obviously I should be able to vote, because fucking you want the Boston Marathon bomber to vote, but I can't vote. I never committed a crime. I'm of much more sound mind than the fucking Boston bomber guy. So if a right is a right and it's absolute, well, then that logic would also apply to the age limits, and we should get rid of the age limits for voting. Right? And furthermore, as everybody's pointed out, and they're right to point it out, plenty of your rights get taken away when you get sent to prison. So the idea that it's like, oh, it's egregious to say, like, while they're in prison, they can't get the right to vote taken away temporarily. Other rights are taken. When you're not in prison, you could wake up, you can go to the deli, you get a sandwich, you go home, you take a nice stroll in the park, and you can do that because you're a free adult and you have your rights. Can you wake up and go to the deli and get a sandwich and go to the park when you're in prison? No. Why? Because we've taken away your rights. So the idea that it's like egregious, it's not egregious. You have to have more than just like scorn on this issue, because 75% of Americans disagree with him. So that requires a clever strategy, an intelligent strategy, and it requires, like, I'm sorry, man, but Bernie really does need better advisors, dude. Listen, this is a tough one, and it's hard to foresee something like this coming, but it's here. And they're going to do more of this. You bet your ass. They're going to always ask him about reparations from now until the fucking election is over. They're going to always ask him now about this. And another one that I think they'll do is the death penalty, because it's another issue where Bernie's correct on it, but it's unpopular with the majority of the American people. So what they're doing, and it's brilliant, sniff out the few issues where Bernie is out of the mainstream and just make him talk about that all day long and sit back and relax. So my advice to him is, you always want to be on your terms, so always pivot to the issues where you already have everybody with you, and don't be afraid in dealing with the media to pull the scorn card, to pull the, swat it aside, this is ridiculous, this is a smear question card, and then take it in the direction where you want to take it, where you're basically wiggling out of a lose-lose situation, because they're setting these up as lose-lose questions. As a general political rule, you're allowed to dodge and obfuscate and swat aside when it's a question that shouldn't have been asked in the first place. That's the new Kyle rule. If it's a legit upfront question, you should answer it as directly as possible. If the whole point of the question is to smear you and to be a lose-lose, you're allowed to go wherever you want to go with that. So that's my breakdown of the situation. I think we all need to be careful, guys. We got to be careful. We need to understand there's a difference between what we like and what all Americans like. On most issues, we actually are totally in agreement with the majority of Americans, but every now and then we're not, and we got to be honest about that. And so Bernie has to be very clever in those circumstances, in that situation. Now, I'd be very curious to see, because I did a poll on this, because I was really interested by it. I did a poll on what do you think about convicted criminals voting? And the first choice was like, they should be able to vote at any time, even while incarcerated, full stop. The second choice was like, no, when you commit a crime, you lose rights, and right to vote is no different, so you should lose the right to vote. Not just for while you're incarcerated, but after you're incarcerated. I would call that the furthest right-wing position, and the most authoritarian position. Then the third option, I put, while you're in prison, you can't vote, but when you're out, your voting rights are restored. And then I put a fourth option, and the fourth option was nonviolent offenders can vote while in prison, but the violent offenders can't vote while in prison, but they can vote when they get out of prison and they serve their sentence. And what was interesting is Bernie's position won with my audience. It got 53% of the vote, a majority, when there were four options. That's pretty overwhelming. But what I'm actually really curious about is what you guys would have said if Bernie hadn't said this. I feel like he may have poisoned the well a little bit and changed a lot of your minds in his direction. But if Bernie never said this and I did that poll, I think it would have been a little bit different. I really do. And I think that perhaps that last position, which by the way is Ro Khanna's position, I think that maybe would have been the number one position. And that last position again was nonviolent offenders can vote and should be able to vote even while in prison, but violent offenders shouldn't be able to vote while in prison, but right when they're out, they can vote. So anyway, I think it's a really interesting topic. I actually think it's a debatable topic, believe it or not. And I just wish Bernie and his team were a little more clever and a little more prepared for these kinds of tripwires, because that's exactly what they are, guys. Make no mistake about it.